Let me share a chilling experience I had in October 2008. I was 22 at the time, brimming with the eagerness of youth and a thirst for adventure. When my childhood friend invited me to accompany him to his family's hometown in a remote part of Nevada to celebrate a festival, I jumped at the opportunity without a second thought. Little did I know this journey would leave me with a memory that still haunts me to this day. After an exhausting 20-hour bus ride from Los Angeles to a small desert town near the Nevada-Arizona border, we finally arrived. The village was exactly how I'd pictured a remote desert settlement. Quiet, with sandy streets, modest homes, and a clear view of the starry night sky. My friend's family was hosting a traditional celebration honoring their cultural heritage. The centerpiece of the festival was a revered elderly woman known for entering a trance-like state, believed to be possessed by a desert spirit, during which she would offer blessings and advice to the townsfolk. The event, though fascinating, stretched late into the night, ending around 10 p.m. My friend suggested we stay overnight at his family's home, but I had an important meeting back in LA the following day and insisted on leaving immediately. The closest train station in Kingman, Arizona was 75 miles away, and I convinced him to make the journey that night. As we searched for transportation, several villagers warned us against traveling after dark. They spoke in hushed tones about the area's paranormal activity, recounting eerie tales of strange figures appearing on the road and ghostly voices whispering in the desert wind. "Son, it's not safe to go now," an elderly man pleaded. "This land has seen too much, wars, deaths, and things you wouldn't understand. Please, stay the night." Their concern was genuine, but I was skeptical and pressed forward. Eventually, we found a local driver, a gruff man in his late 40s with a beat-up blue Jeep, who reluctantly agreed to take us to Kingman for double his usual fare. After a few shots of whiskey to steel his nerves, he returned to pick us up around midnight. The Jeep was an open-top vehicle, and the desert night was eerily silent, broken only by the crunch of tires on the dirt road and the distant howl of coyotes. My friend quickly fell asleep on the back seat, leaving me to sit beside the driver and chat to keep us both alert. The only source of light was the Jeep's headlights, casting long, shifting shadows on the barren landscape. About 15 miles into the journey, the road turned rough, riddled with potholes. The driver slowed to a crawl, and as we navigated the uneven terrain, I heard a whisper in my ear. "Hey! Hey!" Startled, I turned to see who had spoken, but there was no one there. A split second later, I heard a chilling, guttural laugh, loud and unmistakable, as if someone were sitting right behind me. I quickly glanced at my friend, who was still fast asleep, and then at the driver, who was pale and trembling. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He nodded, his voice shaking as he muttered, "I heard it too." Without another word, he slammed his foot on the gas, pushing the Jeep to 90 miles per hour on the bumpy road. The laughter continued, echoing louder and louder, as if mocking us. My heart raced as I looked around the Jeep, hoping to find a rational explanation, but there was nothing, just the endless desert. Suddenly, the driver screamed, "Don't look back." I froze. "Why?" I managed to ask. His voice cracked as he replied, "Someone just put their hand on my shoulder." I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel an oppressive presence behind me. Moments later, the headlights illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the road, cloaked in shadow. As we drew closer, the figure stepped into the middle of the road, blocking our path. The driver honked and shouted, but the figure didn't move. When we were just 10 feet away, it suddenly vanished into thin air. Neither of us spoke after that. The driver kept his foot on the gas, speeding through the darkness as if his life depended on it. We reached Kingman just before dawn, shaken but alive. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I've replayed the events over and over in my mind, searching for a logical explanation, but none of it makes sense. The laughter, the hand on the driver's shoulder, the vanishing figure, they all defy reason. Even now, as I write this, a chill runs down my spine. The desert is a vast and mysterious place, and that night, it felt alive with something far beyond my understanding. If there's one thing I learned, it's to respect the warnings of locals. Some places hold secrets that are best left undisturbed. When I was 7 years old, I was unexpectedly called to the principal's office. Sitting there was my uncle, his face somber. He broke the news. My Budia Nani, maternal great-grandmother, had passed away. He had come to take me to the crematorium, where the rest of the family was waiting for me. At that age, I didn't fully grasp the weight of his words. Death was a concept I had only vaguely understood. My memories of Budia Nani were of an affectionate and hardworking woman, her frail frame bent with age, but her spirit unyielding. She lived in a small village with my maternal grandfather, and we visited her once or twice a year. Her face would always light up when she saw me, and her warmth left a lasting impression on my young heart. The scene at the crematorium was overwhelming. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning wood. My uncle hurriedly undressed me, bathed me in water from the Ganges, and wrapped me in a Ram Nami cloth. I felt disoriented as I was led to the pyre where her body lay, partially covered with only her serene face and fragile feet visible. It was my first close encounter with death and Hindu last rites. The chants, the rituals, and the raw emotion around me were both surreal and unsettling. I stood there, a small boy among grieving adults, trying to make sense of it all. Then a dispute broke out, a heated argument among the extended family about who should light the pyre. Traditionally, the eldest male relative of the deceased performs the last rites. My Budia Nani had only one son, my maternal grandfather, but he was too frail to undertake the ritual. That made me, at 7 years old, the next in line. However, this decision did not sit well with some of the extended family. My maternal grandfather's cousins insisted that one of them should perform the rites instead. Unbeknownst to me, property claims were tied to this ritual. Whoever lit the pyre would have a symbolic and sometimes legal claim to certain family assets. The argument grew louder. I stood there, bewildered, holding the ceremonial flaming torch, while one of my maternal grandfather's cousins, also wrapped in a Ram Nami, stood ready to take my place. The unexplainable moment. Then it happened. Amid the chaos, there was a sudden whoosh. A gust of wind swept through, and without warning, the pyre ignited on its own. Flames roared to life, engulfing the wood and her body in seconds. For a moment, everyone froze. The Damraja, the cremation ground's undertaker, stared wide-eyed, his jaw slightly agape. "I've never seen anything like this in my entire life," he murmured, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. The arguing family members fell silent, their disputes forgotten in the face of this inexplicable phenomenon. My uncle nudged me forward, and the Damraja quickly guided me through the remaining rites. I circled the blazing pyre, completing the Mukagni ceremony by symbolically offering the flame to what was already burning fiercely. The moment became the stuff of family legend. Rational minds suggested that embers from an adjacent pyre, carried by the wind, had ignited the wood. But even the Domraja, who had spent a lifetime witnessing cremations, dismissed this as a common occurrence. He insisted there was something extraordinary about what had happened. For the family, the event solidified Budia Nani's legacy. She had always been fiercely independent, a woman who had lived on her own terms, and now it seemed she had chosen to leave the world the same way, lighting her own pyre as if to declare that she needed no one, not even in death. To this day, the story is recounted during family gatherings. My Budia Nani is remembered not just as a loving great-grandmother, but as a figure of strength and independence, even in the afterlife. Her final act, whether rational or supernatural, remains a poignant reminder of her indomitable spirit, a woman who lived and died entirely on her own terms. Whenever I visit her village or pass by a cremation ground, I think of that day. The smell of burning wood, the sound of chanting, and the sight of her self-lit pyre are etched into my memory, a mix of awe, fear, and deep respect for a woman who, even in death, was unforgettable. During my college years, I heard many chilling tales about haunted places and ghostly encounters, but one story stands out in my memory. It was told to me by my friend Anitha, who recounted an unforgettable experience her elder sister had during a late-night drive through the Appalachian Mountains. Anitha's sister had just given birth and had spent several months recuperating at her mother's home in a small rural town deep in the mountains. When the baby was 6 months old, she decided to return to her home in Asheville, North Carolina. To make the 8-hour journey more manageable, the family hired a car and driver, thinking it would offer the convenience of stopping whenever necessary. They set out in the late afternoon, hoping to reach Asheville by midnight. The route cut through winding mountain roads surrounded by thick forests that seemed to grow darker and more imposing as night fell. By the time they left behind the lights of the villages, the only illumination came from the car's headlights, which carved eerie patterns into the darkness. Around 10 p.m., as the car meandered along a particularly desolate stretch of road, the driver abruptly slowed down and brought the vehicle to a complete stop. Ahead of them, standing motionless in the middle of the road, was the silhouette of a woman. She was dressed in flowing white, the sapat, her long hair cascading down her back. The driver immediately became visibly uneasy. "I've heard stories about this," he muttered. "There's talk of a ghost woman haunting these roads. People say she's looking for revenge or trying to lure travelers to their doom." Anitha's brother-in-law, seated in the front passenger seat, tried to brush off the driver's concerns, but the man was adamant. "I'm not driving past her," he said. "These mountains are full of strange things, and I'm not risking it." The raised voices roused Anitha's sister, who had been napping in the back seat, her infant son cradled in her arms. She sat up, puzzled by the commotion, and asked what was happening. When the others explained, she peered out the windshield and saw the figure herself. There the woman stood, motionless, with her back to them, her stark white dress standing out against the inky blackness of the mountain road. Anitha's sister was not one to entertain superstitions or ghost stories, especially when they interfered with her getting home after a long journey. "This is ridiculous," she said firmly. Despite the protests from her husband and the driver, she made up her mind. With the baby securely in one arm, she opened the car door and stepped out onto the cold, dark road. The others were stunned into silence, watching her approach the figure with a confidence that seemed out of place given the eerie atmosphere. As she drew closer, the woman in white suddenly turned around. Her face was pale, her loose hair obscuring much of her features, and she took a step toward Anitha's sister. For a brief moment, there was a collective intake of breath from those watching, convinced this was the moment when something otherworldly would occur. But Anitha's sister did something no one expected. Without hesitation, she raised her free hand and slapped the woman across the face. "What do you think you're doing?" she scolded. "Standing in the middle of the road like this and scaring people who are already exhausted. Go home and stop causing trouble." The woman in white, utterly stunned, she stammered something incoherent, then quickly turned and fled, disappearing down a narrow dirt path that led off the main road. Within seconds, she was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. Anitha's sister returned to the car, brushing off the shocked expressions of her fellow travelers. "It's just some troublemaker trying to scare people," she said dismissively. "Let's go." The driver, thoroughly embarrassed, sheepishly started the car and resumed the journey. The rest of the ride was uneventful, though the tension lingered. Everyone, especially the driver, was in awe of Anitha's sister's courage and practicality. Later, the family speculated about the mysterious woman. It seemed likely she was just a bored local, pulling pranks on unsuspecting travelers by dressing in a white gown and letting her hair down to play the part of a ghost. But her antics had caused enough fear to stop cars in their tracks and fuel rumors of a haunting on the mountain road. While the story lacked the supernatural horror of true ghost tales, it left a lasting impression. It was a reminder that not every eerie figure in the dark is a ghost, but sometimes human mischief can be just as unnerving. To this day, Anitha's sister's boldness is the highlight of the tale, a testament to how confronting fear head-on can reveal the truth behind even the most spine-chilling encounters. For the rest of us, though, her story serves as a cautionary tale. Whether ghosts or pranksters, the roads at night hold mysteries best approached with caution and a healthy dose of courage. This story is not mine, but my mother-in-law's, and it's something that continues to affect our family to this day. It began about 15 years ago on a seemingly ordinary summer afternoon, but its repercussions have been anything but ordinary. My mother-in-law, Varsha, and my father-in-law were traveling by motorcycle along US Highway 73, a quiet rural stretch cutting through fields and small towns in Kansas. The sun blazed overhead and the heat shimmered off the asphalt. The ride had been uneventful until thirst compelled them to stop. Spotting an old hand pump beneath a large oak tree at the side of the road, they decided to take a break. The scene was serene as they quenched their thirst with the cool water from the pump. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves and the distant hum of insects was the only noise in the air. Just as they prepared to leave, my mother-in-law froze. A voice called her name, Varsha. The sound was clear, unmistakable, and chilling. Startled, she spun around, scanning the empty fields and the road for the source. But there was no one in sight. Not a single car, not a passing pedestrian, not even a bird perched on a branch. My father-in-law saw her reaction and asked what was wrong, but when she explained, he shrugged it off as a trick of the wind or her imagination. They continued their journey, but something had shifted within her. That single moment marked the beginning of an unrelenting, eerie phenomenon that no one could explain. From that day forward, my mother-in-law could no longer sleep peacefully. Nights became a torment of vivid, unsettling dreams. These were no ordinary dreams. They were visions, fragments of events yet to unfold. The faces of the dead would appear to her, and she began to see premonitions of tragedies within the family. Worse still, every prediction came true. At first, my in-laws dismissed her experiences as stress or mere coincidences. When her insomnia became unbearable, they sought help at a renowned hospital in Kansas City. She was diagnosed with chronic insomnia and prescribed powerful medications, but nothing worked. No matter how high the dosage, sleep eluded her, and the dreams persisted. When I married into the family, I heard these stories and assumed they were exaggerated or the result of an overactive imagination. But then I witnessed events that made me reconsider. One incident still gives me chills. About a month ago, my father-in-law's elder brother was hospitalized with a severe illness. As the family fretted over his condition, my mother-in-law quietly told her husband the exact time and manner in which his brother would pass. Days later, her prediction came true, down to the minute. There have been countless other instances over the years. She foresaw accidents, illnesses, and losses within the family. Each time, her visions were eerily accurate. While some family members found her ability unsettling, others began to rely on her warnings, even though it caused her immense emotional strain. Imagine living with such a gift, or curse. My mother-in-law has spent the last 15 years tormented by dreams she cannot control and a reality she cannot escape. She avoids discussing her experiences in public, fearing ridicule or disbelief. Yet within the family, her abilities have become an unspoken truth, a weight we all carry in different ways. For her, the agony is compounded by the inability to sleep. Despite trying every available medication and treatment, relief remains out of reach. Some nights, she sits awake for hours, staring into the darkness, haunted by the knowledge of what is to come. Over the years, we have sought explanations beyond medicine. Some have suggested that the voice she heard on Highway 73 was a spirit, calling her and awakening this ability. Others believe it was a moment of spiritual awakening tied to the land's history. Highway 73 cuts through areas steeped in Native American history, and some speculate that she may have encountered a lingering presence tied to the past. We've even consulted spiritual healers and clergy hoping for answers or solace, but the mystery remains. Was the voice a warning, a gift, or a curse? We may never know. 15 years later, my mother-in-law continues to endure her strange reality. For the rest of us, it's a mixture of awe, fear, and heartbreak. Her visions, while accurate, bring her no peace, only the weight of knowledge she never asked for. Highway 73 may look like an ordinary road, but for our family, it's the place where everything changed. We'll never forget the voice that called her name or the life it set into motion. So the next time you find yourself on a lonely highway, remember this story. Sometimes what you can't see may be far more real and far more haunting than what you can. It was the winter of 2010, and our family had just finished a long Thanksgiving visit with my grandmother in a small town in rural Maine. With the holidays winding down, my parents and I boarded a night bus headed back to Boston. The biting cold and the snow-covered landscape made the journey feel like something out of an eerie New England postcard. Night buses have their own kind of rhythm. Passengers settle in, the driver powers through the dark roads, and somewhere along the route there's always a stop at a roadside diner. Ours came at a little after midnight when the bus pulled into a lonely truck stop flanked by a rundown diner and a snowy, empty parking lot. The passengers shuffled out, grateful for the chance to stretch their legs and grab some food. Inside, the diner was a warm contrast to the icy winds outside. As we sat around a rickety table, sipping steaming cups of coffee and eating sandwiches, the chill of the winter seemed almost tolerable. But the tranquility was short-lived. We had just stepped back into the frosty night, preparing to board the bus again, when it happened. The hum of conversation and the crunch of snow underfoot were interrupted by a strange, low rumble. It grew louder until the source came into view, a motorcycle speeding down the desolate highway. But there was something terribly wrong. The rider had no head. The bike sped past the truck stop, the rider sitting upright, his hands firmly gripping the handlebars and his feet planted on the pedals as if nothing was amiss. The machine roared into the night, vanishing down the dark highway like a phantom fleeing some unseen torment. For a moment, no one spoke. Every passenger froze in place, staring at the road where the headless figure had disappeared. The cold winter air seemed to grow even more frigid, as if the chill had seeped into our very bones. My mother was so paralyzed with shock that she couldn't move even as we tugged her toward the bus. Others huddled together, murmuring prayers or whispering to one another in hushed, fearful tones. Some claimed it was the spirit of a long-dead biker doomed to wander these roads. Others insisted it was a bad omen, a warning that the rest of our journey would not be safe. Fear hung thick in the air as the bus driver, pale and visibly shaken, declared he wouldn't drive another mile until a local pastor came to bless the vehicle. It was nearly 2 a.m. by the time the pastor arrived. He carried a small Bible and a vial of holy water, which he sprinkled over the bus while murmuring prayers for protection. The passengers, huddled in the freezing cold, watched solemnly as the ritual unfolded. The driver, satisfied that the evil had been warded off, finally agreed to resume the journey. By dawn, the memory of the headless biker still lingered in the minds of everyone aboard. But what we discovered later sent an even colder shiver down our spines. The truth behind the terrifying vision was more horrifying than any ghost story. As we neared our destination, we passed a police barricade. A tow truck was hauling away a mangled motorcycle, and a few officers were taking notes by a crumpled semi-truck carrying oversized steel sheets. From our seats, we could see the blood-streaked highway and the grim expressions of the authorities. A local news report would later reveal the chilling details. Earlier that night, a biker speeding down the highway had collided with the steel sheets overhanging from the back of the semi-truck. The sharp edges of the steel had severed his head instantly. At the high speed he was traveling, the bike had continued down the road for nearly a mile before finally toppling over. The ghostly sight we had witnessed wasn't a phantom or an omen. It was the tragic aftermath of a gruesome accident. The horror lay not in the supernatural, but in the fragility of life and the dangers of the road. Even now, every time I see a semi-truck with an oversized load or hear the roar of a motorcycle at night, I think of that headless biker. Was it merely an accident, or had his spirit returned to haunt the highway, replaying his final moments over and over again? Perhaps some roads are destined to hold on to the memories of those who have traveled them and those who never made it home. The story begins on a frigid winter night in the early 1960s. My parents, both young teachers at the time, and my Uncle Lou, a close family friend and colleague, were driving along Interstate 80 through the barren, snow-covered stretches of Nevada. They had just turned onto I-80 in Winnemucca, heading west toward Reno. It was a desolate route, especially in the dead of winter, where even the few scattered cars seemed like rare phantoms of the road. This was an era before cell phones, GPS, or even roadside payphones. A breakdown on this lonely stretch of highway could mean hours, or worse, of waiting for help in the bitter cold. Lou, the driver, had just bought a shiny new Corvair, and he handled it with extreme caution, mindful of the icy roads and the unsettling isolation. Snow fell steadily, muffling the sounds of the night, and a heavy silence filled the car as they drove, each passenger lost in their thoughts. Then it happened, peered in the beam of the headlights. Its form was disturbingly hoarded, with long, vaporous arms that seemed to reach out toward it. Out of nowhere, a grotesque humanoid figure appeared in the beam of the headlights. Its form was disturbingly human-like, but stretched and distorted, with long, vaporous arms that seemed to reach out toward the car as though trying to grasp it. The figure hovered just above the road, its shape flickering like smoke caught in a windless space, and yet its presence felt oppressively real. Lou instinctively swerved, narrowly missing the figure, and for a fleeting moment it peered directly into the windshield. My parents described its face, or what should have been a face, as featureless and otherworldly, as if carved from mist. There was no sound, no thud as the car would have made if it struck a person or animal. The figure simply vanished into the darkness as abruptly as it had appeared. The car continued on in stunned silence. Lou, ever the skeptic, refused to stop, pressing forward with white-knuckled determination. He never admitted to seeing the figure, but those who knew him best believed he would have stopped if he thought it was a real, living person in need of help. My parents, however, were shaken to their cores, and to this day, they disagree about what exactly they saw that night. Years later, as the story was retold in hushed tones, the truth, or something close to it, began to emerge. That stretch of I-80 had long been known for its dark history of disappearances and grisly discoveries. In the early 1970s, the bodies of several women were found scattered along the highway. In July 1972, the nude body of a young woman, shot with a .22 caliber gun, was discovered near the Star Valley exit. Later that year, another woman's body was found strangled and burned north of Highway 93, while a third victim was uncovered in Elko. In 1978, two more women were found, one stuffed into a duffel bag and buried in a shallow grave near the Inlay exit. The second victim, Nan Dixon, vanished without a trace after being last seen at a Texaco station in Lovelock. Her abandoned car was found 4 years later, bearing eerie signs of foul play, including black electrical tape with strands of hair. The tragedies didn't stop there. In 2006, Judith Casita disappeared along the same stretch of highway, her car found abandoned on a dirt road. 5 years later, in 2011, Patrick Carnes was last seen driving westbound, but his car was inexplicably discovered on the eastbound side of the highway. His body never found. That same year, Army soldier Joseph Bushling vanished after calling a friend for help, saying he had run out of gas. His car was discovered miles from his last known location, but his body was never recovered. Over the decades, I-80 through Nevada has earned a grim reputation. Reports estimate that more than 500 bodies have been found along the highway, leading many to believe it's a hunting ground for one or more serial killers. Yet others suspect something far more sinister, something supernatural, is at play. To this day, my parents, now in their 80s, remain haunted by that strange figure they saw on the highway all those years ago. My mother is convinced it was a ghost, a spirit trapped in the limestone-rich land, its energy replaying a moment of terror or anguish. My father, a man of science, leans toward a more rational explanation, suggesting it was an optical illusion caused by swamp gases, or perhaps a trick of the snowy landscape and their own tired minds. Still, the question remains, could this figure somehow be connected to the dark history of I-80? Were the disappearances and murders the work of a human predator? Or could the figure itself have been a harbinger of doom, an omen for those who dared to cross its path? Even as time has dulled the fear, the story lingers in my family, Faye, shared during long nights when the wind howls outside and shadows stretch across the walls. My parents often wonder if others have seen the same figure, or if the desolation of that Nevada highway has conjured unique terrors for each traveler who dares to traverse it at night. As for me, I've never driven that stretch of road, and I don't plan to. Whether haunted by ghosts, marked by tragedy, or simply cursed by geography, I-80 in Nevada carries an air of foreboding that's hard to ignore. If you ever find yourself traveling that highway at night, remember, some roads are lonelier and darker than they seem. It was 2004, a cold December night in the rural outskirts of Oregon. My uncle and aunt were returning from a family wedding held at a quaint country inn, nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. The wedding had been a lively affair, filled with laughter, music, and dancing that stretched well into the early hours of the morning. By 2:30 a.m., it was time for them to make the long drive back to their home in Bend. The route to the wedding venue had been scenic, but perilous. Narrow, winding roads hugged the cliffsides, punctuated by sharp turns and deep potholes. Adding to the danger was the absence of streetlights, making nighttime travel on that path akin to courting disaster. So instead of retracing their steps, my uncle opted for a safer alternative, the state highway. Though it added an extra 30 minutes to the journey, the well-paved road and gentle slopes made it the wiser choice. They set off on their aging Harley-Davidson motorcycle, a relic of the 1980s that still purred like a loyal companion. My aunt climbed on as the pillion rider, wrapping herself tightly in her shawl against the biting cold. The chill of the wind nipped at their faces as they merged onto the highway. As the bike hummed along, the couple began to talk about the evening's events. They lamented how no one in the family had thought to offer them a place to stay for the night. My uncle, though grumbling about the inconvenience, couldn't help but enjoy the scenic beauty. The highway was flanked by towering pine trees and majestic snow-capped peaks, their silhouettes bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight. 10 minutes into the ride, the serenity of the journey began to waver. A sense of unease crept over them as the road stretched ahead, eerily empty. The silence, broken only by the hum of the bike, felt oppressive. It was then, as they rounded a gentle curve, that my uncle saw it. Standing about 100 yards ahead on the roadside was a figure that defied logic. At first glance, it looked human, tall and gaunt, but as they drew closer, its unnatural proportions became evident. The figure's pale, almost translucent skin glowed faintly under the moonlight. It stood unnaturally still, its elongated limbs and featureless face giving it the unsettling appearance of a mannequin left abandoned in the wilderness. My uncle slowed the bike instinctively, his eyes locked on the figure. It turned its head toward him with an almost mechanical motion, its face devoid of recognizable features save for a jagged mouth that seemed to grin unnaturally wide. Then it moved. In a blur, the entity darted behind a cluster of bushes by the roadside, its speed defying comprehension. My uncle's hands trembled on the handlebars as the bike wobbled slightly. "We need to keep going," my aunt said sharply, her voice trembling but firm. She had seen it too. Despite his fear, my uncle gripped the handlebars tightly and pressed on. The motorcycle roared as he accelerated, the figure now a haunting memory in their rearview mirror. The remaining 10 minutes of the journey felt like an eternity, but they eventually reached the safety of their driveway. When they finally stumbled inside their home, my uncle collapsed onto the couch, pale and shaking. For days, he remained ill, plagued by fever and vivid nightmares. His small business suffered as he struggled to recover, missing critical deadlines and losing several contracts. A week later, when the topic came up again, my uncle hesitantly asked my aunt, "Did you see it that night?" She nodded solemnly. "It was a Bakoda," she whispered, using the term her grandmother once used for a shape-shifting demon in Appalachian folklore. The creature, she explained, preys on the fearful, feeding off their terror. Known to haunt remote roads and forests, the Bakoda is said to appear in a grotesque form, with jagged features and unnatural speed. "What did it want?" my uncle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "To possess," she replied grimly. "It targets the scared and the weak. If we had stopped, who knows what would have happened." Though they never encountered the entity again, the memory of that night lingered, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lurk in the shadows of the wilderness. To this day, my uncle avoids late-night rides, especially on lonely highways. Some fears, once etched into the soul, never truly fade. This story takes place in 2003, and even though I wasn't there, it still gives me chills whenever I think about it. My father and mother had just gotten married, and were traveling to our family's native town in the countryside. They were accompanied by my aunt and cousin sister, and the four of them were making the journey by car. My mother was seated in the front passenger seat, and my father was driving. My aunt, who had a tendency to get motion sickness, swapped seats with my mom for comfort. As they drove along, everything seemed normal at first, but then my aunt suddenly started screaming. She shouted, "Paya apne wolatke ko mar dia! Apne wolatke ko mar dia! Brother, you killed that boy! Brother, you killed that boy!" My father and mother were both stunned. Everyone in the car went silent, and a cold shiver ran down their spines. My aunt kept repeating the phrase, almost like a chant. My father tried to calm her, insisting that there was no boy outside, but my aunt wouldn't stop. She insisted there was a boy, and she was certain that my father had killed him. Suddenly, my aunt's behavior became even more erratic. She slipped from her seat, falling to the floor of the car, and both my mother and cousin were terrified. In a panic, my father drove quickly to the nearest town where a relative of ours lived. This relative was a strong man, so my father hoped he could help lift my aunt and take her to a hospital. However, she was so heavy that neither of them could move her. It was as if something invisible was weighing her down. They quickly called my grandmother for advice, and she told them to seek out a Baba, a spiritual healer. The Baba arrived at our relative's home shortly afterward, and my aunt was laid on a steel cot. But as the Baba began chanting his prayers, something terrifying happened. My aunt began to levitate off the cot. At first, I didn't believe it, but I was told that there were many witnesses who saw it happen. After levitating for a moment, my aunt fell unconscious. The Baba explained that the road they had traveled on earlier was haunted. He said that a family had been in an accident there, and that a boy had been killed. When my aunt started screaming about the boy, she had seen his ghost. The Baba revealed that if my family had gone back to show her that there was no boy, they would not have made it out alive. When my aunt woke up, she still didn't believe that my father hadn't killed the boy. To prove the truth, the Baba went to the boy's grave and returned with his shoes. Only then did my aunt start to accept what had happened. Months passed, but my aunt continued to grieve whenever she saw a child in distress. She would cry, remembering the boy's tragic fate. That incident haunted my family for years, and to this day, no one can ever forget the terror they experienced that night. It was the winter of 2010 when my parents and I were traveling back home from my maternal grandmother's house in Assam. We were on a night bus, heading back to our home in Meghalaya, a state known for its long winter breaks. The bus was a night-hauling one, and those who've traveled on such buses know that there's usually a short stop for dinner at a roadside dhaba restaurant. We had just finished our meal and were preparing to board the bus when something unimaginable happened. As we were walking back to the bus, we saw a man riding a bike at high speed. But there was something terribly wrong. This man was headless. The bike was still moving smoothly, almost like it was gliding, with the rider's hands on the clutch and foot on the gear, but his head was completely missing. The bike continued to move at high speed for a good mile or more before disappearing into the distance. Everyone around us was frozen in shock. The winter air, usually so cold it could pierce the skin, seemed to hold its breath, as if even the night itself was trying to understand what it had just witnessed. My mother was so stunned that she couldn't move, even though we were trying to pull her inside the bus. We were all terrified, too frightened to speak or even think clearly. It wasn't until later that we learned the truth behind what we had seen. A truck carrying an oversized load of steel sheets, some of them suspended in the air due to the way the load was stacked, had been crossing an intersection just as the biker was passing by. The sharp edges of the steel sheets had sliced the biker's head off in a split second. Because the biker was traveling at such high speed, the bike continued on its path without the rider's head, gliding for a good distance before coming to a stop. It turned out that the incident wasn't supernatural at all, but rather the result of a tragic accident. An accident made all the more horrific by the fact that there were no restrictions on oversized loads on the road, which allowed the truck to be carrying such a dangerous load in the first place. The driver of our bus, visibly shaken by what we had just witnessed, refused to continue the journey until a ritual for safety was performed. A priest was called from a nearby temple in the dead of night, and the driver insisted that the ritual be carried out before we could move on. The priest performed the prayers, and after a few tense hours, we finally resumed our journey. It was an experience that rattled our minds to the core, and one that I will never forget. The chilling image of the headless biker, the eerie silence of the night, and the aftermath of the accident stayed with me for a long time. It was a crisp night, more than 20 years ago, when I found myself walking back home from a party. I had been in a cab with two girls, and they dropped me off about half a mile from my house. The area was a quiet suburban stretch with a few scattered buildings and thick shrubbery that lined the path. I had walked this route countless times, but that night felt different. Something was off, an eerie tension in the air that I couldn't shake. As I made my way along the grass, I began to feel it. Someone was following me. At first, I thought it might be my imagination, but the feeling grew stronger with each step. I could hear footsteps behind me, matching my pace but never catching up. My heart raced, and every instinct told me to turn around, but I couldn't. I felt paralyzed with fear, yet strangely compelled to keep walking. The path seemed longer than usual, and I noticed the chill in the air. My surroundings felt suffocating, the once familiar path now feeling like a labyrinth. My legs were trembling, and I wanted to scream, to run, but something held me back, something that felt like a force I couldn't see but could sense. Suddenly, I heard a voice, soft but clear, whispering in my ear, "Don't run, don't scream. Keep walking, you're safe." The voice was soothing, and despite the fear that gripped me, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I turned my head slightly, trying to see who had spoken, but there was no one there. The words echoed in my mind, and it felt as if the voice came from deep within, from somewhere otherworldly. I believe now that the voices were angels. As I continued walking, the footsteps behind me grew closer. My heart hammered in my chest. I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, a fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Yet somehow I could feel an invisible protection surrounding me, like a divine aura that shielded me from the imminent danger. Just as I neared the entrance to my house, the voice spoke again, louder this time. "Now, scream! Now! Call your brother! Call for his help!" The panic set in as I realized that my parents weren't home and the only person there was my brother. Without thinking, I screamed with all the force I could muster, the sound of my voice breaking through the night. The fear that had held me in place evaporated, replaced by the adrenaline of knowing I had to get away. I ran as fast as I could, stumbling over the uneven ground as the man behind me closed in. His hands grabbed at my throat, and I could feel the pressure as he tried to choke me. My breath became shallow, and I fought desperately to break free. In that moment of terror, I heard the sound of my brother's footsteps. He had heard my scream. He ran downstairs, his quick thinking alerting the chief of police who lived in our building. Within seconds, they were there, pulling the maniac off of me just in time. The man was arrested, his sinister intentions thwarted before they could escalate any further. I later realized how close I had been to something far worse. If I hadn't listened to those voices, those angels, and if I hadn't screamed when I did, I would have been too far from help for anyone to hear. The angels' guidance and the protection I felt saved my life that night. To this day, I believe that force, that aura of divine protection, was the only reason I made it home safe. There are roads I avoid, but not because of any supernatural beliefs. It's not that I think they are haunted, at least I don't think so, but there are simply better routes to take for practical reasons. For example, the most direct way from my house to the highway runs through a crowded residential area. The road is plagued with so many speed bumps, it feels like I'm driving through a minefield. Honestly, I lose count of how many there are. It's slow, uncomfortable, and feels like a chore every time I have to drive through it. So, naturally, I always take a detour. A slight deviation from the direct route reduces the number of bumps to 7, and because of the smooth tarmac and a higher speed limit, the ride feels much easier, and it takes about the same amount of time. So why would I put myself through the direct route when the detour offers a much more pleasant drive? Then there are other roads that I avoid for safety reasons. Some roads around here were built on a whim, without proper planning or construction. They're narrow, winding, and poorly maintained, which makes them more prone to accidents. I've heard stories of cars skidding off the road or crashing due to bad turns or loose gravel, and honestly, it just doesn't seem worth the risk. Why take that road when I can take one that's less dangerous, even if it adds a few extra minutes to my trip? And of course, there are roads that are simply boring. They stretch on for miles, nothing but rows of identical houses or empty fields. It's monotonous, and there's nothing interesting to look at. So why not choose a route that offers a more scenic view? There's a lovely stretch of road that meanders through a forest and skirts along a river. The trees seem to stretch up forever, and the view of the water sparkling in the sun makes the drive feel like a mini vacation. I'll take the longer route any day for that. But despite all the reasons I've had for avoiding certain roads, it's never been because of any ghost stories or eerie tales about haunted places. It's always been about practicality, time, safety, and comfort. Sure, I've heard rumors about some places being haunted. I live in a town with a rich history, and every old house and abandoned building seems to have its own story. But none of those tales have ever made me fear a road or path. I've always thought of them as just that, stories, nothing more. That is until one night when I was driving home late. It was around midnight, and I was coming back from a late shift at work. I was tired, and the thought of taking the same old road to get home seemed unbearable. But the other route, the one that avoided all the speed bumps and gave me a smoother ride, felt like the best choice. I made the turn and started down the familiar stretch of road. But tonight, something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The night was unusually still, and there wasn't a single car in sight. No headlights from other drivers, no distant sounds of city life. Just quiet. Too quiet. As I drove further, the streetlights seemed dimmer than usual, casting long shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the road. The trees on either side of the road were taller than I remembered, their branches hanging lower, almost as if they were closing in on the car. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to tiredness. But the further I drove, the more uneasy I felt. My headlights began to flicker, as if something was interfering with the power. That's when I saw it, just ahead of me, a figure standing by the side of the road. I slowed down, unsure of what I was seeing. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so. It was standing perfectly still, dressed in dark clothing. Its face was hidden in shadow, and it seemed to watch me with an unsettling stillness. My heart began to race. There were no streetlights here, and yet the figure was somehow illuminated, just enough for me to see its outline. I didn't stop. I kept driving, my foot pressing harder on the gas pedal, but as I passed the figure, I could feel its presence, as if it was still watching me from behind. A shiver ran down my spine, and I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure wasn't there anymore, but something in my gut told me I wasn't imagining it. The rest of the drive home felt longer than usual. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see something following me. The lights from my house were a welcome sight when I finally reached it, and I quickly parked my car, locking the doors behind me. As I walked into the house, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe I'd just been looking for something to spook me. But the feeling lingered, and I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing by the road, staring after me. The next day, I mentioned it to a neighbor, jokingly asking if they knew anything about that stretch of road. Their reaction was immediate. A look of concern flashed across their face. "You shouldn't go down there at night," they said. "That road has always been strange. People say it's haunted, but I don't know. I'd avoid it if I were you." I laughed it off, telling myself that I'd never been the type to believe in ghost stories. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but think about the figure. Maybe there was something to those rumors after all. And maybe, just maybe, there were roads I should stay away from, not because of speed bumps, accidents, or boredom, but because something truly strange and unexplainable lingered there. In September 2017, during our MBA program, three of my friends, two guys and a girl, and I decided to take a trip to the northeast of India. It was a spur-of-the-moment plan, with each destination being decided only after we left the previous one. Our route was to cover Shillong, Cherrapunji, and Daki, all stunning locations in the region. We had rented a Honda Amaze in Guwahati, and I was the only one among us who could drive. The journey started smoothly, with Shillong and Cherrapunji being as beautiful as we had imagined. After exploring these two places for the first couple of days, on the third day, we decided to go on a trek to the Rainbow Waterfalls, located near Cherrapunji. The 12 to 15 kilometer trek was exhausting, but the sight of the waterfall was breathtaking, especially with a rainbow appearing in the mist. It was a moment of sheer awe that made all the effort worth it. By the time we finished our trek and headed back, it was already 5:30 p.m. We were faced with a decision: stay in Cherrapunji for the night or drive to Dalki, which was 84 kilometers away, according to the map. I checked the route and it said it would take about 2.5 hours to get there. Feeling confident, I told my friends that I was sure we could make the drive in 2 hours and find a hotel or a tent on the way. My friends, exhausted from the day's activities, were hesitant, but they ultimately agreed, knowing I would be driving. We confirmed with the locals, and they assured us that the road was in good condition, so we decided to go for it. The first 10 to 12 kilometers were easy, but soon the road began to deteriorate. It became so narrow and poorly lit that we could barely see the white lines. The road was winding, and the conditions made it harder to drive. My friends, who had intended to sleep, were now wide awake, visibly nervous. The tension in the car was palpable. Sudipto, one of my friends, broke the silence, asking with a teasing tone, "Swapnil, you're enjoying this, aren't you?" I tried to lighten the mood, replying, "Of course. I love a bit of adventure. It was the winter of I've got this." But inside, I was starting to feel the weight of the situation. It was the first time I was driving on such a road, and it wasn't even my car. On top of that, we had already walked so much that day, and now we were still on the road at night with no end in sight. By the time it was 11 p.m., we were still on the road with hardly any vehicles passing by. We kept asking, how much longer, and what time will we reach? We were all tired, and the uncertainty was starting to get to us. Then, around 11:30 p.m., Kushbu suddenly exclaimed, "It's already 11:30. How much longer?" I checked my phone and it showed 11 p.m. Surprised, I checked everyone else's phones. Kushbu's phone was displaying the time as 11:30, and mine and the others showed 11. Confused, I thought maybe there was something wrong with the phones. But then Sudipto shouted, "Kushbu's phone has an active internet connection, and it's showing Bangladesh time because we're so close to the border." That's when we looked to the right, and sure enough, we could see the border, and the map confirmed that we were near the Bangladesh border. Relieved that we were finally approaching Daki, we continued our journey until we reached the BSF check-in gate. The sight of Daki felt like a small victory, but our troubles were far from over. We had not booked a hotel for the night, having been so focused on getting there that we hadn't thought about the next step. Daki, being a small town, had very few options for accommodations, and by the time we arrived, the town was nearly empty. Everyone had already gone to bed, and the streets were deserted, except for some drunk strangers and BSF personnel. With no place to stay, we ended up trying to sleep in the car. However, it was hot and humid, and it started raining, making it impossible to get any rest. So we decided to sit outside, talking through the night, too scared to sleep. We spent hours discussing everything from our trip to how strange and unsettling the night felt. It was one of those moments that bonded us as friends and marked a night we would remember forever. While Sudipto and Kushbu learned the importance of planning ahead, I learned a valuable lesson about staying calm in the face of uncertainty. The experience left us with a sense of shared adventure, one that, even after all these years, we still talk about. When I was 15, I moved to Kota to attend coaching classes as a NEET aspirant. At that age, I was reckless and indifferent about my health, and I didn't believe in anything spiritual. I was living in a hostel on the second floor near Alan Sabal, a place known for its high number of coaching centers. The hostel wasn't anything special, but it was decent enough for a student like me. The summer heat was unbearable, and air conditioning or even a cooler was a must to survive. One hot afternoon, around 4 p.m., the power went out. The generator kicked in immediately, but by 9 p.m., it too ran out of fuel, and the electricity was still nowhere to be found. The oppressive heat made it nearly impossible to stay in our rooms, so I, along with three of my friends, decided to sit in the stairwell, which was cooler due to a window above that let in some fresh air. We spent the next few hours chatting and gossiping, not even feeling the time pass. It was around 1:08 a.m. when I checked my watch last. About an hour later, as we were still sitting there, we heard the sound of someone rushing down the stairs. One of my friends, trying to make light of the situation, joked, "Oh ho, who's in such a hurry to meet someone?" But there was no answer. The sound continued, and we all looked at each other, a little confused. We assumed that maybe someone was in a rush for some reason. Feeling concerned, we decided to go downstairs and check. At the bottom of the staircase, our warden was sitting in a chair. We approached her and asked if anyone had come down. She looked at us with a blank expression and said, "Beta, no one has come down since the power went out." My heart sank. We all stood there in shock, staring at each other, unsure of what we had just experienced. I tried to rationalize what happened, telling myself it was just a trick of the mind, but deep down, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling. A week later, on a Saturday night, I was studying late into the night, as there was no coaching the next day. It was around 3:30 a.m. when I realized I had run out of drinking water, so I decided to go outside and fill my bottle. The water cooler was located in the middle of the corridor, and as I stood there, filling my bottle, something strange happened. I suddenly felt an overwhelming, chilling sensation. It was as though an invisible force was telling me, "Don't turn around. Whatever you do, don't look back." The fear was so intense, I could almost feel it in my bones. I knew in that moment that if I turned around, I would be in grave danger, as if my life was about to be taken away. I closed my eyes, gripped the water bottle tightly, and began chanting the name of Lord Hari, praying for safety. Gradually, the feeling began to subside, but I still felt a lingering sense of unease. I hurried back to my room, heart racing, and locked the door behind me. After that night, I left the hostel for good. That experience shook me so much that I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something beyond our understanding in this world, something spiritual. I never spoke about what happened to anyone until about a year later when I visited my Nani, my maternal grandmother. She asked me how my hostel life had been, and that was when I finally shared the story with her. As I finished recounting the events, my Nani looked at me with a knowing expression. She told me that it wasn't just a coincidence, that it was my soul warning me about the danger. "Your soul was trying to protect you," she said. "In the future, always listen to your inner voice." Even now, as I write this, I can remember that night so vividly. It feels like it happened just yesterday. From that point on, I started trusting my gut instincts, never questioning the feelings I had, no matter how strange they seemed. I learned to trust the silent whispers of my soul, and I've never ignored them since. Thanks to Lord Hari, nothing like that ever happened again, and I am grateful for the protection I felt. I urge everyone to listen to that inner voice. If something feels wrong, trust that feeling and stay away from whatever you're doing. Your instincts are there for a reason. I was in a store one afternoon, casually browsing the jewelry section when a woman approached me. She was middle-aged, with soft eyes that seemed to carry a weight of unspoken knowledge. She smiled gently and said, "Someone wants to thank you." Her words caught me off guard, and I paused, trying to make sense of what she meant. She went on to say that this person had been following me for a few years and had brought flowers for me. My curiosity deepened, but I was still confused. She then asked, "Have you ever saved anyone?" My mind raced. I had worked at a hospital for years, sat with countless patients as they neared the end of their lives, but I had never saved anyone. I had comforted the dying, but I hadn't been the one to pull someone from the brink of death. I told her as much. and she asked if I had ever performed CPR. I shook my head. Her face softened, but she didn't seem to believe me. She insisted that this person was sure that I had saved someone and that I had been with a man when it happened. Then her words took a strange turn. He also mentioned pizza. I almost laughed at the oddness of it all. Pizza? What did that have to do with anything? I started to walk away, thinking I was simply dealing with someone who had mistaken me for someone else. But then she said something that made me freeze. He also mentioned a bike. Suddenly, my mind snapped to a memory I hadn't thought about in years. My husband had died in a motorcycle accident, but this couldn't be him. I wasn't sure why, but that fleeting mention of a bike had stirred something in me. I thought back to a day long before that conversation in the jewelry store. I remembered pulling up to a crowd of people gathered on the side of the road. There had been a terrible accident. A man had been hit by a car while riding his bicycle, and the crowd seemed paralyzed, unsure of what to do. There was one young woman kneeling beside the man, trying to keep him awake and alert, but she seemed overwhelmed. Without thinking, I rushed over and knelt beside them. The man's head was bleeding, and he looked disoriented, but his eyes were still open. I leaned in and spoke to him, trying to keep him conscious, reassuring him that help was on the way. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later, and I prayed silently, hoping he would pull through. It was so heartbreaking to see someone so young in such a state, but I couldn't stop myself from talking to him, urging him to hold on just a little longer. As the paramedics loaded him into the ambulance, I felt a glimmer of hope. He would be okay. He had to be okay. But as I later learned, the man passed away on the way to the hospital. He never regained consciousness. The accident had happened right in front of a Domino's Pizza, the very place where I had stopped to grab a late-night bite before heading home. That detail, the mention of pizza, had struck me in that moment, and I finally realized what the woman in the store had meant. It wasn't my husband, it was the man from the bike accident, the one I had tried to save. He had somehow found a way to thank me, even after everything had ended. I didn't save him in the way I would have wanted, but I had been there when he needed help, and maybe that was enough. I'm not sure what to believe about the whole situation, but I'll never forget that moment in the store when a stranger reminded me of the life I had touched, even in the most unexpected way. I never really believed in anything supernatural, but there are moments in life when you just can't ignore certain things around you. It all began when I moved to the city for my studies and started living in a hostel. The place was conveniently located, but there was a railway track just behind the building. The sound of the trains passing by was constant, a rattling noise that would shake the windows of the hostel, making it hard to focus or sleep, especially at night. I had a room on the 4th floor, which I shared with 2 other roommates, and though it wasn't a bad setup, the noise from the trains made everything feel unsettling at times. Months passed, and I grew used to the clatter, but one night, something happened that I couldn't just brush off. It started with a shrill, screeching sound, a woman's voice. It wasn't a normal noise, and it sent chills down my spine. At first, I thought it might be one of the girls in the hostel, but there was something off about it. The sound felt so real, so immediate, but also distant, as if it came from far away or maybe somewhere not quite from this world. My roommates and I looked at each other, but no one said anything. We tried to ignore it, dismiss it as some odd noise, but over the next few nights, it kept happening. I had never been particularly superstitious, so I tried to brush it off. But after a while, I started feeling uneasy, especially when I had to go down the long corridor to get water from the cooler. The sensation of being followed like someone walking just behind me became harder to shake off. There were times when I'd hear footsteps, but no one would be there. This continued for weeks. I was exhausted from sleepless nights, but still, I tried to power through. Eventually, I decided to move to the ground floor with a friend, hoping that a change of scenery might help. But the moment I settled into the new room, things took an even stranger turn. At night, I would often wake up and see a woman standing in the corner of the room. She never came close to me, never spoke a word, but she would just stand there, watching. I couldn't explain it. Every time I looked, she was there, her figure barely visible in the dim light. I'd close my eyes thinking I was imagining it, but when I opened them again, she was still there, still staring. I never mentioned it to my friend. I wasn't sure how to. I didn't want to sound crazy. The nights grew harder to endure. My mind became plagued with exhaustion, and I started questioning everything. One evening, as I lay on my bed trying to fall asleep, I turned over and froze. There, sitting at the edge of my bed, was a small child. I could see their face clearly, staring at me with wide, dark eyes. I was paralyzed with fear. My body went cold, my heart racing in my chest. I reached out my hand, half convinced that I was seeing things, but the child remained there, staring at me with an eerie stillness. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. For what felt like an eternity, I just lay there, too terrified to even scream. Finally, I gathered the courage to sit up and look away, and when I looked back, the child was gone. Shaking, I stood up and walked out of the room. I couldn't stay there any longer, and I didn't know who to talk to. I decided to go to the warden the next morning and tell her what had been happening. Her response was more unsettling than I could have imagined. She looked at me calmly and said, "Dear, I have a master's degree in science, and I don't believe in these things either. But a long time ago, there was a train accident just behind the hostel on that very railway line. Many people lost their lives that day. Since then, people have reported experiencing strange occurrences like this. I've heard it from other students over the years. But you need to be strong. Don't let it overpower you." I couldn't say anything. I left her office, feeling a cold shiver run through me. The woman in the corner, the child at my bedside, all of it suddenly made sense, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. I didn't know if it was the spirits of those who had died in the accident or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But after that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in that hostel. I left the hostel soon after that, but I never had the feeling of being watched, chilling experiences I had there. To this day, I can't explain it, but there are moments when I'm alone, when I hear the faintest sound or feel the chill of a cold presence, and I can't help but wonder if there's something out there, something we don't understand waiting just beyond our sight. In October 2008, I was 22 years old and, like most young adults, eager to explore new places and experiences. One of my school friends invited me to visit his native village, Jalore, in Rajasthan during the festival of Navratri. Without giving it much thought, I agreed. Little did I know, this trip would become a haunting experience that would stay with me for years. The journey to Jalore was a grueling 20-plus hours by bus. We started from Mumbai and made our way through Mount Abu, finally reaching a small village in Rajasthan. The place was exactly as I had imagined a rural Rajasthani village to be. Dusty roads, sparse vegetation, and houses scattered far apart. My friend was eager to participate in a Devi Puja, a worship ritual, at a small house in the village. It was already around 4 p.m. when we arrived, and though I wasn't very interested in the ceremony, I decided to tag along. My friend explained that the lady hosting the puja was believed to be blessed by the goddess, and every Navratri, after sunset, she would get possessed by the divine spirit. The villagers said she could offer blessings and solutions to people's problems. While I found the whole concept a bit strange, I figured I might as well see what all the fuss was about. By the time the puja was finished, it was around 10 p.m. My friend suggested I stay at his place, but I had an important work commitment back in Mumbai, and I couldn't afford to waste any more time. I was determined to leave that very night. We needed to reach Mabu, 120 kilometers away, to catch a trip back to Mumbai. But the village was so remote that finding transport at that time was nearly impossible. After some effort, we finally found a local man willing to drive us to Mount Abu. I offered him a double fare to make him agree. He said he'd return in 30 minutes, and we could begin our journey. While we waited, the villagers kept urging us not to go. They warned that the area was known for paranormal activity and that many people had experienced strange events there. One of them said, "Beta iswak jana thik nahi hai, yahan pe bahut kuch ajeeb hota hai. Tum logon ko yahan ke bare mein kuch pata nahi hai. Mat jao." It's not safe to go at this time. A lot of strange things happen here. You don't know what this place is like. Don't go. They weren't forcing us, but the concern in their voices was hard to ignore. Still, I was set on leaving and ignored their warnings. After what felt like an eternity, the driver finally arrived, about 90 minutes late, smelling faintly of alcohol. He had clearly indulged in a few drinks. The vehicle was an old, open Jeep, and my friend, ever the lazy one, immediately slouched into the back seat and dozed off. I sat beside the driver, trying to keep the conversation going, but the only light was the dim glow from the Jeep's headlights. The road was in poor condition, with potholes in several places, so we had to slow down to a crawl. As we passed one particularly rough stretch of road, I heard a whisper in my ear. "Ai," it said, soft but clear. "Ai" means come in Hindi, but it felt more like a command than an invitation. Before I could process the sound, I heard a loud, unnerving laugh. It wasn't a friendly chuckle. It sounded like someone was sitting in the Jeep, laughing at something I couldn't understand. I glanced over at my friend, still asleep, and then looked at the driver, who seemed just as startled. We exchanged wide-eyed looks of confusion and fear. The laugh came again, louder this time, and the driver slammed his foot on the accelerator, speeding up to 90 kilometers per hour. The sound of the laughter echoed in the vehicle, getting louder with each passing second, until the driver yelled, "Don't look back! Don't look back!" I was frozen in place, my heart racing. He told me that someone had just put a hand on his shoulder. The air felt thick and suffocating, like something was pressing in from all sides. I glanced nervously out of the window, hoping to see something that would explain what was happening, but all I could see was the desolate, empty road. As we drove on, trying to outrun the terror that gripped us, we saw something at the edge of the road. A figure, standing in the middle of nowhere, appeared briefly in the headlights. At first, we thought it was just a man crossing the road, but as we got closer, the figure suddenly stepped into the middle of the road and just stood there, staring. We were only about 10 feet away when in an instant the man vanished into thin air. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone. Both of us were too terrified to speak. The atmosphere inside the Jeep was tense and heavy, filled with dread and disbelief. We didn't know what we had just witnessed, but we couldn't deny what had happened. The rest of the journey was silent, with both of us too shaken to say anything. We reached Mount Abu in one piece, but the memory of that night still haunts me. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something we couldn't explain. That eerie laugh, the whispering voice, and the vanishing figure, everything felt too real to be a mere coincidence. It was an experience that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world, and even now it sends a chill down my spine whenever I think about it. We were driving home from a wedding 3 hours away from our city. The night had been a beautiful celebration, full of laughter, dancing, and plenty of drinks. My boyfriend had stayed sober to drive us back, while I was admittedly tipsy and on the edge of passing out in the passenger seat. The route back was mostly dark country roads, long stretches of asphalt framed by endless fields and the occasional cluster of trees. It was late, and the only light came from the dim glow of our car's dashboard and the beam of our headlights cutting through the blackness. I was half dozing, lulled by the hum of the engine, the rhythmic bumps of the road, and the warm haze of alcohol. I don't remember the exact moment I first noticed it, but somewhere along that lonely stretch of road, a sudden brightness pierced through my half-closed eyes. At first, I thought it was just another car behind us, its high beams washing over the interior of our vehicle. The light felt overwhelming, almost unnatural in its intensity, but in my half-asleep state, I dismissed it as an annoyance. Then my boyfriend screamed. It wasn't a startled shout or a yell of frustration, it was primal. A deep, guttural scream that came from somewhere deep inside him, filled with pure terror. I've never heard anything like it before, and I hope I never do again. The car lurched violently to the right as he swerved off the road. I felt the tires skid, gravel spitting against the undercarriage as we narrowly avoided plunging into a ditch. My seatbelt dug into my shoulder as I was jerked upright, now fully awake and alarmed. "What? What's happening? Are you okay?" I stammered, my heart pounding as adrenaline kicked in. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He was trembling, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "There was a truck," he managed to say, his voice shaky and hoarse. "A huge truck. It came right at us." I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. "Truck?" I turned around in my seat and looked through the rear windshield. The road behind us was empty, completely and utterly empty. It was a long, straight stretch of asphalt with no intersections, no driveways, no streetlights, and no houses. Just darkness stretching as far as the eye could see. There were no taillights fading into the distance, no sign of movement, and no rumble of a massive vehicle retreating into the night. "Are you sure?" I asked hesitantly. "There's nothing there." He was shaking his head, his eyes darting back and forth, scanning the road as if expecting the truck to reappear. "I saw it," he insisted. "It was huge, and it was coming right at us. I thought we were going to die." I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had dozed off for a split second and dreamed it. Maybe his eyes had played tricks on him in the dim light. I even entertained the possibility that he'd had some kind of waking hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But then I remembered the flood of light that had woken me us moments before, the brightness that had stung my eyes, making me squint in discomfort. I hadn't dreamed that, and it wasn't the kind of light our car's old, weak headlights could produce. We sat there for a few minutes, both of us trying to calm our racing hearts. The night was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. Not even the sound of crickets or the distant rustle of wind. Just nothing. Eventually, he started the car again and cautiously eased us back onto the road. The rest of the drive was tense, every shadow and flicker of light putting us on edge. Neither of us spoke much, each lost in our own thoughts. When we finally reached home, he was still visibly shaken. Over the days and weeks that followed, I found myself replaying that moment in my mind, trying to piece together what had happened. My boyfriend remained adamant that he'd seen a massive truck barreling toward us, its headlights blazing, filling the road with light. But how could that be? On that narrow country road, there was no way a truck could have passed us without hitting our car or running us off completely. And there was no sound, no roar of an engine, no rumble of tires, no crunch of gravel under a vehicle's weight. I've tried to explain it away. Maybe it was an optical illusion, a reflection of light from some distant source, or even a vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I'm not sure I believe those explanations. Sometimes late at night, when I'm lying in bed and the house is quiet, I think about that night, about the light that wasn't there and the truck that couldn't be. And I wonder, was it just a trick of the mind? Or was it something else, something we aren't meant to understand? I'll never know for sure, but one thing is certain. I'll never forget the sound of my boyfriend's scream or the strange, unshakable sense of wrongness that filled the air that night on that dark country road. When I was younger, my family and I embarked on a road trip to Yellowstone National Park. If you've never been, I highly recommend it. It's a place of raw, untouched beauty. But before we could revel in the park's splendor, we had to endure the journey. And from our home in California, it was a grueling 17-hour drive. Our trusty Yukon XL became our second home during those days, as we spent hours on the road, breaking up the monotony by stopping at little motels along the way. We were behind schedule, though, and one night my dad decided to push through and drive straight through the night. He did his best, but by the wee hours of the morning, fatigue got the better of him. To keep us safe, he pulled off at a small, unlit rest stop in the middle of a dense forest. I couldn't tell you what state we were in. It was one of those flyover states, just another pin on the map of our road trip. My brothers and I had long since fallen asleep, lulled by the rhythm of the road, so the sudden stillness of the car parked in that lot barely registered. Sometime during the night, I stirred awake. The car was pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face. My family was slumped in various uncomfortable positions, fast asleep. I wasn't scared at first, just disoriented and restless. I tried shifting around, hoping to get back to sleep, but it wasn't happening. The stiffness in my back and neck demanded I find a distraction. Looking out the window seemed like a good idea, even though the darkness beyond made it hard to see anything. Luckily, I'd packed a couple of flashlights for the trip. Quietly, trying not to disturb my family, I reached into the back seat, unzipped my bag, and pulled out a small yellow flashlight. It wasn't the brightest thing in the world, but it was enough to illuminate the immediate surroundings. I pressed the flashlight to the car window and flipped the switch, casting a faint beam of light into the inky blackness. At first, the view was unremarkable, a typical tree line, bushes, and the vague shapes of branches swaying in the cold night air. But then I noticed something unusual. Between two trees in the distance stood a dark shape. It was too upright and rigid to be part of the natural surroundings, and its outline vaguely resembled a man. It didn't move, though. It just stood there, still as a statue. I stared at it for what felt like forever, trying to convince myself it was just a bush or an odd tree trunk. But the longer I looked, the less convinced I became. Just as I was about to write it off and turn off the flashlight, the shape moved. It turned a full 90-degree pivot and disappeared behind one of the trees. The blood drained from my face. My heart raced as adrenaline surged through my body. My first instinct was to shut off the flashlight, plunging myself back into darkness. Then I threw my sweater over my head like a shield, as if that flimsy layer of cotton could protect me from whatever or whoever I'd just seen. I sat frozen in my seat, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. My breathing was shallow, my ears straining to hear any sound beyond the hum of my family's snores. I didn't dare move or peek out the window again. What if it was still out there? What if it had seen me? I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed curled up in a semi-fetal position, too terrified to even think about waking my parents or brothers. What could I say? That I'd seen a shadow in the woods? I was sure they'd brush it off or tell me I was imagining things. When the first rays of sunlight pierced the darkness, my fear began to ebb. The world outside transformed from a shadowy unknown to an ordinary rest stop surrounded by trees. When my dad started the car and we pulled back onto the road, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Exhausted from my sleepless night, I finally drifted off as the highway stretched out before us. But even as I slept, the memory of that shadowy figure lingered in the back of my mind. To this day, I've never told anyone in my family about that night. Maybe it was nothing, just a trick of the light or my imagination playing tricks on me in the darkness. But deep down, I know what I saw. It wasn't the stunning geysers or majestic wildlife of Yellowstone that left the biggest impression on me during that trip. Instead, it was the figure in the woods, a shadow that remains etched in my memory, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't what you see in the daylight, but what you glimpse in the dead of night. Years ago, a friend and I decided to visit another mutual friend who was attending university in a quaint little college town. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, a chance to reconnect, catch up, and experience campus life. We had detailed directions printed out. This was before GPS became a standard thing, and our friend had assured us the drive would take about 3 hours. We set off in the early afternoon, excited for the trip and chatting away as we drove. At first, everything was normal. The highways were clear and the directions seemed straightforward. But as the journey stretched on, we realized it was taking much longer than we expected. I don't remember the exact point at which the scenery began to change, but at some point, we found ourselves entering a dense forest. The road narrowed, flanked by towering trees on either side that seemed to close in on us the further we drove. The sunlight dimmed, filtered through thick canopies of leaves, and the once busy roads turned eerily quiet. At first, it was charming, a picturesque detour through nature. But as the minutes turned into what felt like hours, the charm wore off. We seemed to be driving through those woods forever. The winding roads stretched endlessly, each curve revealing yet another stretch of trees and shadow. My friend checked the directions again. We hadn't missed any turns, we hadn't hit traffic, and apart from a brief stop at a gas station earlier, we hadn't lingered anywhere. Yet the clock told a different story. We were already past the 3-hour mark, and the woods showed no signs of ending. The further we went, the more unsettling it became. The air inside the car grew heavy, and the usual flow of conversation between us trickled to silence. There was no radio signal, and our phones were as useless as paperweights in this isolated stretch. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the woods gave way to open fields and familiar sights. We rolled into the college town nearly 4.5 hours after we had left home. Exhausted but relieved, we shrugged off the odd delay. We didn't dwell on it. The excitement of seeing our friend and spending the weekend together quickly took over. The return trip, however, reignited the mystery. On our way back home, the journey took just over 3 hours, the exact time frame we had been promised originally. There were no dense woods, no interminable stretch of forested roads. It felt straightforward, uneventful, and baffling. The strangeness of the first trip didn't truly hit me until the next time I visited. On this second visit, I decided to pay closer attention, hoping to pinpoint where the detour into the woods might have occurred. But as I retraced our original route, following the same directions as before, the trip was a smooth, predictable 3 hours. There were no dense woods, no narrowing roads, and no eerie silence. The entire drive was as ordinary as it could be, with highways, small towns, and farmlands marking the way. I visited our friends several more times over the years, and not once did I encounter the endless stretch of forest again. To this day, I don't know what happened during that first trip. How did we lose so much time? Where exactly were we when driving through those woods? And why did that particular stretch of road never appear again? I've considered every logical explanation I could think of. Perhaps we made a wrong turn somewhere, or the directions had taken us on a longer scenic route that wasn't repeated later. But none of those answers fully satisfy the memory of those woods. Their oppressive silence, the way time seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the fact that no such road seemed to exist on subsequent trips. It's been years now, and the memory of that strange journey has faded slightly, but every so often it resurfaces in my mind. I still wonder, what really happened on that drive, and where were we when we passed through those endless, shadowy woods? Living in Northern California, I often make the trip down to Los Angeles to visit family. My usual route combines the 101 and the 5, a straight shot if I'm in a rush. But I've always been one to savor the journey, often setting aside a day or two extra to explore, take scenic detours, and enjoy the quirks of small-town California. That habit of taking my time has served me well, like the time my car broke down and I was beyond relieved I didn't have to scramble back to work the next day. One of my more memorable trips took me through Diablo County. I remember it vividly because of this enormous, absurd cow statue that loomed over the freeway. You couldn't miss it. Bright, gaudy, and completely out of place in the otherwise dusty, barren landscape. On that particular day, my boyfriend at the time and I decided to stop for food at the lone establishment in sight, a Denny's. The parking lot was oddly packed, with at least a dozen cars crammed into the spaces around the diner. This struck me as strange, given that the rest stop was practically in the middle of nowhere, just dusty hills and empty stretches of highway as far as the eye could see. Still, we shrugged it off, figuring it must be the only decent spot for miles. As soon as we stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. The hostess, who had been deep in conversation with a man near the entrance, immediately stopped talking and turned to look at us. Her expression was pure fury, her eyes narrowing as if we'd just committed some unthinkable offense by walking through the door. It wasn't the usual irritation you might encounter from someone having a bad day at work. This was something else. An anger so intense it made me want to turn around and leave. But before I could even process it, she snatched up 2 menus, her movements sharp and deliberate, and gestured for us to follow her. She led us through the diner, past at least 4 empty sections, before finally slapping the menus down on a table far from anyone else. Without a word, she turned and stormed off. My boyfriend and I exchanged uneasy glances, both of us wondering what we'd done to provoke such hostility. What made it even stranger was the emptiness of the diner. Despite the packed parking lot, I couldn't see another soul inside. No other customers, no sounds of clinking silverware or casual chatter, just an eerie stillness. The service we received after that initial encounter was flawless. quick, efficient, and oddly quiet. The hostess returned to take our order, her earlier anger replaced with a polite but distant demeanor. It was as if the entire bizarre moment at the door had never happened. As we ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The empty diner, the inexplicable hostility, the strange isolation of the place, it all felt surreal. I kept glancing around, expecting to see other diners emerge from some hidden section or workers bustling around in the background, but there was nothing. When we finished our meal, we paid and left without incident. Back outside, the sight of the crowded parking lot added another layer of confusion. Where were all the people? If there weren't other diners inside, where had all these cars come from? The barren landscape offered no answers. There wasn't another building in sight, just miles of dusty hills and that ridiculous cow statue in the distance. As we got back on the road, I couldn't stop thinking about the experience. The encounter wasn't exactly terrifying, but it was deeply unsettling. It felt like we'd stumbled into a place that didn't quite belong, where the rules of normalcy didn't fully apply. Even now, I find myself revisiting that moment in my mind. What was with the hostess's reaction? Why was the parking lot full when the diner was empty? And how could a tiny Denny's in the middle of nowhere feel so charged with an inexplicable sense of wrongness? I don't have any answers, just lingering questions and a vague unease whenever I pass through Diablo County. It wasn't the scariest experience of my life, but it's one I'll never forget. It was late in the evening, around our 10s. My mom and I boarded a coach to leave Ibiza. We were being shuttled to the airport, making stops along the way to pick up other passengers. At first, it seemed like any other departure, routine and uneventful. But as the journey progressed, a strange atmosphere settled over the coach. The driver seemed unusually tense, his body language tight, and his eyes darting to the mirrors more than necessary. He was driving faster than seemed safe, sticking almost exclusively to back roads. It wasn't long before we began noticing police checkpoints at junctions leading to other roads. Officers stood alert, their expressions serious, and their presence was unsettling. Above us, helicopters roared through the sky, their spotlights slicing through the darkness as they flew toward a nearby town. It was clear that something serious had happened, though no one on the coach seemed to know what. Whispers passed between passengers, theories forming, but the driver remained silent, focused solely on his task. The tension was palpable, like an invisible weight pressing down on everyone. The feeling didn't leave me even when we reached the airport. The eeriness followed us through security and into the plane. It lingered in my chest until we finally landed back home, where the familiar comfort of normalcy eased it away. To this day, I wonder what was happening that night in Ibiza. What event had caused such an atmosphere of urgency and unease? The second unsettling experience occurred during a visit to family in Norfolk. One of my relatives' husbands was a gamekeeper for local farmers. In the evenings, he'd often take me along to teach me how to shoot with his high-powered air rifles, the kind that require a license. It was a fascinating and thrilling experience, a mix of skill and discipline. One night, after a long session, we packed up and began the drive back. The countryside was pitch black, the kind of darkness where the only light came from our headlights slicing through the night. At first, the drive was quiet, but I noticed something odd. He kept checking his mirrors. At every turn, his eyes darted to the rearview mirror, scanning for something I couldn't see. His usual calm demeanor had shifted, replaced by an air of watchfulness. After a while, he turned off the main road and took a detour. For about 10 minutes, we navigated winding roads through the countryside, his eyes constantly flicking between the road ahead and the mirrors. I didn't ask questions. I could sense it wasn't the right time, but my curiosity was mounting. Eventually, we pulled up to a friend's house. We went inside, exchanged pleasantries, and stayed just long enough for the tension to break. When we left, it wasn't the same way we'd come in. Instead, he took a completely different route back. I never found out what had prompted his behavior that night. Was it a precaution, something he had seen or sensed? Or was it just an overabundance of caution from someone used to navigating the isolated and often unpredictable rural areas? The experience left me with a lingering feeling of unease. It was a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can shift into the uncanny, where the familiar becomes fraught with tension and unanswered questions. Both journeys, one in Ibiza, the other in Norfolk, taught me that even the simplest trips can be tinged with mystery, leaving you wondering long after they're over. Back in 2011, my sister made a baffling decision that would set the stage for one of the most grueling experiences of my life. Out of all the colleges in California, she chose Southern Arkansas University in Magnolia, Arkansas. To this day, I can't understand why. Maybe it was the affordability or some inexplicable pull she felt toward that small town school. Regardless of the reason, her choice set a chain of events into motion that none of us could have predicted. Even stranger than her choice of college was my mom's insistence that we drive her there. With nothing substantial to move, I argued that flying made far more sense. My sister could buy whatever she needed once she arrived. My main concern, however, wasn't the logistics. It was the timing. It was the middle of January. While California's winter was mild, I knew the same couldn't be said for the states we'd be traveling through. But as usual, my logic didn't win out. A week later, I found myself crammed into a car with my sister, mom, and grandpa, embarking on what would soon become the road trip from hell. The journey was manageable at first, though tensions were already running high. Long hours in a packed car with little to do made for short tempers. But everything took a sharp turn when we reached the Dallas area. Out of nowhere, a vicious winter storm slammed into the region. The temperatures plummeted, snow blanketed the roads, and icy conditions turned the highways into skating rinks. We pressed on, thinking we could outrun the worst of it. That plan fell apart as we approached a small town called Mount Pleasant, Texas. The snow and ice became too treacherous to navigate, and my mom, panicked and unsure of what to do, pulled over near an exit ramp. That's when the car's front tires slid into a snowdrift. We were stuck. For 20 agonizing minutes, we pushed and heaved, our shoes slipping on the icy ground, until we managed to free the car. We pulled into a nearby gas station, only to find it closed. To make matters worse, the car's heater chose that exact moment to stop working. The four of us huddled in the freezing vehicle, our breath visible in the air, trying to conserve body heat. After what felt like an eternity, about 4 hours, the gas station owner arrived. The gas station owner turned out to be our saving grace. Not only did he let us inside to warm up, but he also offered us coffee and food, a small mercy that felt monumental in our desperate state. He warned us against continuing our journey, explaining that conditions were even worse further north. After some debate, we made the tough decision to turn back and return to California. While the decision to head home seemed like the safest choice, it didn't mean the journey back would be easy. The long hours on the road started to take a toll on my grandfather, who was in his early 70s. We hadn't realized it at the time, but he was in the early stages of dementia. The first sign of trouble came at a rest stop in New Mexico. We had stopped for a quick break, but when it was time to leave, my grandpa was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as we searched the area, calling his name and scouring the parking lot. After 45 minutes of frantic searching in the biting cold, I found him standing next to an idling semi-truck, shivering. The driver had been kind enough to let him warm up, but the incident left us shaken. The rest of the trip home was uneventful, but overshadowed by the physical and emotional toll of what we'd been through. When we finally pulled into our driveway in California, we were exhausted, freezing, and utterly defeated. The trip had tested our patience, our resilience, and even our family dynamics. Looking back, that ill-fated journey was a lesson in planning, preparedness, and most importantly, listening to your gut when it's telling you something is a bad idea. It took me years to shake the experience. For a long time, I refused to leave the state, not even for short trips to nearby places like Las Vegas. Though the ordeal is behind me now, the memories remain vivid, a reminder of how quickly a simple road trip can spiral into chaos. And as for my sister, she never ended up attending Southern Arkansas University. When I was about 24, I set out on a road trip with my two best friends, cruising down the breathtaking Pacific Coast Highway in California. It was one of those golden adventures you dream of in your early 20s. Freedom, friendship, and the open road. We had the perfect soundtrack blasting, snacks piled high, and miles of coastal beauty stretching ahead of us. At one point in the evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the horizon in shades of orange and pink, we stopped for gas at a small, nondescript station. While refueling, I noticed a guy in Army combat uniforms, ACUs, sitting on the side of the road with backpack and a sign. He was hitchhiking. As an Army veteran myself, my heart immediately went out to him. I couldn't help but feel a kinship with someone I assumed had shared similar experiences. But my friends weren't as easily convinced. I managed to talk them into it, though, with a plan that sounded sensible at the time. I'd approach him first, verify that he was a veteran, and make sure he wasn't dangerous before offering him a ride. Of course, plans rarely go the way you expect. I pulled over and barely had the car in park before the guy took matters into his own hands. He opened the hatchback, tossed his pack inside, and climbed into the back seat before I could even get around the car to speak to him. My friends, wide-eyed, exchanged glances. We'd already divided up pocket knives and pepper spray among ourselves, ready to defend our lives if necessary. It was a mix of adrenaline and sheer disbelief that kept us from reacting immediately. The hitchhiker, who introduced himself as Flowers, was around our age, mid-20s, and let's just say not exactly what we were expecting. It became obvious fairly quickly that he was not a veteran. He was also high as a kite. Despite his somewhat sketchy appearance, he turned out to be pretty mellow, even friendly. That didn't make us any less uneasy, especially when he casually lit up a joint in the car without asking. None of us were comfortable with that, though he did generously offer to share. The real kicker? Flowers didn't actually have a destination. His plan was simple: south. Unfortunately for us, we still had about 7 hours of driving ahead, and the idea of his vague destination didn't sit well. I was behind the wheel, trying to focus on the road, while my friends texted furiously back and forth, strategizing how to get him out of the car without creating a scene. After about an hour of nerve-wracking tension, I decided we needed to act. I spotted a random restaurant in the middle of Big Sur, a small, quiet place with just enough activity to make it seem like a plausible stop, and pulled in. "Isn't Heather supposed to meet us here?" I asked, throwing out a name that none of us knew, but hoped would sound believable. My friends, catching on immediately, chimed in with enthusiasm. "Oh yeah, Heather, she said she'd be here by now." We all got out of the car, Flowers included, and while he was distracted, we discreetly unloaded his backpack from the trunk. As soon as his belongings were on the ground and we were safely back inside, I started the engine and we sped off. My heart raced as the restaurant disappeared in the rearview mirror. Looking back, I know how incredibly lucky we were that nothing went wrong. Flowers didn't lash out or cause a scene, and for all his quirks, he seemed harmless. Still, the reality of what we'd done hit me hard as the adrenaline wore off. We had picked up a total stranger in the dark, isolated on a long stretch of highway. It could have ended very differently. Later, when we stopped for the night, we found his hitchhiking sign in the back seat, a simple cardboard piece with the word South scrawled in big letters. I kept it, a small but significant reminder of the lessons learned on that trip. It's been 4 years since that night, and the sign still sits in my closet as a testament to one truth: some risks just aren't worth taking. I've never picked up another hitchhiker, and I never will. But that experience remains etched in my memory, a story we still laugh about, nervously, whenever we reminisce about that wild road trip down the Pacific Coast Highway. Many years ago, a close friend and I decided to visit a mutual friend at her university for the weekend. Excited for a fun getaway, we meticulously planned the trip, armed with detailed directions from our friend, who assured us the drive would take about 3 hours. We set off with the kind of carefree enthusiasm that comes with road trips in your youth. The sky was clear, the roads smooth, and our spirits high as we chatted and laughed, eager to reach our destination. At first, the drive seemed to go as planned. The directions were spot on, and the scenery was exactly what we expected: open stretches of highway, small towns, and a few rolling hills. But then, something changed. I can't pinpoint the exact moment it started, but at some point, we found ourselves entering a dense, shadowy forest. The trees loomed high above us, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that cast the road in a dim, almost eerie twilight. The woods were thick and seemingly endless, the kind that feel untouched by time. We kept driving, expecting to emerge from the forest after a few miles, but it stretched on and on. The road twisted and turned with no landmarks or signs to indicate where we were. We weren't lost. Our directions didn't suggest we had taken a wrong turn, but the woods felt like they had no end. By the time we finally emerged from the forest, we realized something was off. It had been over 4 hours since we left home, and we were still miles from the university. The trip was supposed to take 3 hours total, yet here we were, well past the time frame with no explanation for the delay. When we finally arrived at our friend's college town, exhausted and bewildered, the clock showed 4.5 hours since we'd started. We were late, but the relief of seeing our friend and settling in for the weekend quickly erased the strangeness of the drive. The woods became an afterthought as we dove into the fun and laughter of the reunion. It wasn't until the drive home that the weirdness resurfaced. The return trip took just over 3 hours, exactly as our friend had initially predicted. My companion and I exchanged puzzled glances, but shrugged it off. Maybe we had misjudged the timing on the way there, or perhaps it had simply felt longer because of our excitement and anticipation. Months later, I made another trip to visit our friend. This time, I was determined to figure out what had happened during that first drive. I followed the exact same directions, paying close attention to every turn and stretch of road. But no matter how carefully I looked, the long path through the woods was nowhere to be found. The trip was uneventful, taking just about 3 hours. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. On subsequent visits, I retraced the same route over and over, always hoping to spot those mysterious woods again. But they never appeared. There was no dense forest, no endless winding roads, no shadowy canopy. It was as if that entire stretch of the journey had vanished. Even years later, I can't explain it. There were no detours, no road closures, and nothing to suggest we had veered off course that first time. Yet somehow, we spent an extra hour and a half driving through a place that, by all accounts, doesn't seem to exist. To this day, I wonder where we really were during those missing hours. Was it just a trick of memory? A strange detour we failed to notice? Or was it something more inexplicable, like slipping into another place for a brief moment in time? I'll never know, but the mystery of the vanishing woods lingers in my mind, a haunting reminder of a journey that defies explanation. The summer after high school graduation was a time of freedom and excitement for my friends and me. We decided to make it memorable by embarking on a road trip with a twist. We were going to stay in haunted places. As someone fascinated by the paranormal but lacking any personal ghostly encounters, I was thrilled. Armed with a copy of Haunted Texas, we planned our first stop, a charming, historic bed and breakfast with a reputation for ghostly happenings. The B&B was everything we hoped for. Creaky floors, dim lighting, antique furnishings, and an eerie air of history. We spent hours exploring, sneaking into every unlocked room, and whispering excitedly about the possibility of spotting a ghost. As dusk fell, we ventured out for dinner, returning late into the night when the house was silent and its other guests presumably fast asleep. It didn't take long for our curiosity to get the better of us. Armed with shiny new digital cameras, state-of-the-art at the time, we headed downstairs to the main area. We wanted to test our luck, snapping photos in hopes of capturing an orb, shadow, or any sign of the supernatural. The air was thick with both excitement and nervous giggles as we crept around, whispering about the spooky stories we had read. That's when we heard it. The doorknob on the front door rattled, its metallic jiggling unmistakable. We froze, our cameras momentarily forgotten, and turned toward the door. The knob twisted, turned back, then jiggled again. Someone was trying to get in. Is that one of the other guests? One of us whispered nervously. We waited, expecting to hear the creak of the door opening or to see someone step inside. But the door didn't move. The rattling stopped, and the room fell silent once more. We exchanged uneasy glances. Were we about to be caught sneaking around in the middle of the night? It wasn't like we were doing anything wrong, but the idea of explaining to some late arriving guest, or worse, the owners, that we were ghost hunting felt mortifying. The door remained firmly shut. We hadn't heard the sound of anyone walking away, and the large glass outer door, visible through the window, hadn't moved. Trying to shrug it off, we reassured ourselves that it was nothing unusual. Maybe the wind, maybe someone had jiggled it and realized they were at the wrong house. Our initial excitement for ghost hunting waned after that. A chill lingered in the air, and the fun had shifted to unease. Not long after, we decided to call it a night and retreated upstairs to our room. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the old house sounded amplified in the stillness of the night. Shadows seemed darker, and the air felt heavier. Morning couldn't come soon enough. The next day, bright sunlight poured through the windows, and the house seemed much less sinister. We were ready to leave and head to SeaWorld, eager for a day of carefree fun. As we left, we exited through the same front door from the night before. That's when we noticed something that made our stomachs sink. The wooden front door was protected by a heavy glass storm door. It creaked loudly when opened, and when it closed, it slammed with a sharp, unmistakable sound. We stared at each other, the realization dawning in silence. The glass door hadn't moved the night before. We hadn't heard its telltale creak or slam when we watched the doorknob rattle. Whoever or whatever had been trying to open the door couldn't have been a person. We didn't linger to discuss it. Instead, we shared a series of wide-eyed glances and piled into the car. "Weird," someone finally muttered, and that was the extent of our conversation about it. None of us wanted to admit how shaken we were. The rest of the trip was uneventful, save for a few orbs in our photos and the occasional creepy story we told ourselves to keep the mood alive. But the memory of that doorknob stayed with me long after. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night at the B&B. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a trick of the mind. Or maybe it was something beyond explanation. A small brush with the paranormal in the quiet stillness of that haunted house. One thing is certain. That summer road trip left me with a story I'll never forget. In 2005, my wife, Susan, and I, along with another couple, embarked on an exciting road trip through Scandinavia. Our journey was a carefully planned mix of scenic drives and cultural exploration. The itinerary had us flying into Helsinki, Finland, before taking a ferry to Stockholm, Sweden, driving to Gothenburg, and then ferrying to Denmark to complete our trip. The first leg of our journey started smoothly. We drove westward from Helsinki for about 100 miles, the roads stretching through lush green landscapes and picturesque countryside. Eventually, we arrived at Fiskars, a quaint village known for its beautifully restored 17th century foundry and artisan shops. Nestled among the verdant forests and serene streams, the village exuded charm, beckoning us to stop and explore. I parked our car at the top of a small embankment overlooking the village, and we spent the next hour wandering through cobblestone streets, admiring the craft shops and historical architecture. The air was crisp, the atmosphere serene, and it felt like time had slowed down. When it was time to leave, we walked back to the car, still basking in the idyllic experience of Fiskars. I climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and stepped down on what I thought was the brake. To my horror, I had mistakenly pressed the clutch. The car, instead of stopping, began to roll forward toward the embankment's edge. The next few seconds felt like slow motion. Susan and our friends screamed as the car edged closer to the drop. My friend, in a reflexive and futile attempt to brace himself, grabbed at the car ceiling. My mind raced with the terrifying prospect of the car tumbling front first over the edge and landing on its roof. Then something miraculous happened. The car stopped abruptly, its two front wheels suspended in midair. Dazed and shaken, we realized that a large rock, placed to reinforce the embankment wall, had come loose and wedged itself under the car, halting our descent. Carefully, we all exited the vehicle, one by one, holding our breath, as if any sudden movement might upset the car's precarious balance. Once we were safely out, we stood a few feet away, marveling at our incredible luck while contemplating the car's unlikely position. Recognizing the need for help, we walked to the Fiskars factory store nearby. The store manager quickly grasped the gravity of our predicament. He needed only to step outside to see the car teetering over the edge. Without hesitation, he began making phone calls. Unfortunately, Finland's Auto Association was tied up with a major accident, and their assistance wasn't immediately available. Unfazed, the manager reached out to the town's engineering department. Within an hour, a local truck driver arrived to assess the situation. However, after examining the car's precarious position, he realized he couldn't handle the task alone. Determined to help, he returned with reinforcements, a second driver and a forklift. The operation to rescue the car was nothing short of dramatic. With the forklift maneuvered carefully from the front, the team worked to lift the car and align it with the rear wheels, inching it back to its original parking spot. All the while, we held our breath, watching every movement like spectators at a high-stakes performance. Finally, the car was back on solid ground. Miraculously, when the undercarriage was inspected, not a single scratch or dent was found. The relief we felt was immeasurable, and we couldn't thank our Finnish rescuers enough. We offered them a reward for their efforts, but they firmly declined, their warm smiles and friendly waves reminding us of the genuine kindness of strangers. As we drove away from Fiskars, this time with someone else behind the wheel, we couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. What had started as a serene day in a picturesque village had turned to an unforgettable adventure, one that we would recount for years to come.